think it's a legitimate debate to be had. And it's the things like that bother me because it's like, yo, we're not even allowing ourselves to have the conversation. Like, you're just putting these labels on people. Like, I'm transphobic because I feel like I'm, just using a little common sense here. To your point, there's just certain things minors cannot do because they're minors. So you don't think something as big as changing your gender shouldn't, wait until you're at least 18? Like, that's just like the fact that people can't even have a conversation about that without labeling somebody transphobic is very, 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 very strange to me.
That was radio host and media mogul Charlamagne Tha God denouncing the lack of debate around gender-affirming care for trans youth. What do you make of this, Robby?
Yeah, I mean, I think he is expressing something a lot of people feel about this debate, that activists who are on the pro-trans side or are very in favor of allowing these medical procedures to be available react very negatively and label people transphobic for asking questions about it. It's a contentious issue, and one obviously there's a lot of dissension on. A lot of people feel differently about it. And we're trying to have an intelligent conversation on the show about it. We've invited guests who are more informed than we are to tell us about why they feel in various ways. It's something, there's mainstream coverage asking questions about what are the long-term effects of puberty blockers if you start them early, how many people desist after having a gender dysphoric diagnosis or feelings. There's a lot to kind of grapple with here, and I get that. I, as a libertarian, I am like extremely averse, so averse, more averse than almost anyone, to saying, well, the state should come in and tell you can't do this. Honestly, we could just take that off the table because I don't really feel that way. But whether it's good or not, whether this is healthy or whether this is wise, is something we should be allowed to discuss of its own accord, even if there's not going to be a policy component.
I think that's precisely the problem, that the way that Charlamagne Tha God has framed it there as, are we allowed to talk about this, really ignores the extent to which there actually are laws being promulgated and on the books now that would have the state intervene and prohibit parents from making the choices that they want to make. So I'm torn because at the end of the day, I think a lot of the pushback and the kind of rush to characterize people as transphobic is because there is a lot of really bad faith just asking questions out there. And there is some good faith just asking questions out there as well. But knowing that there is this political effort to use, I think, a very widespread kind of uncertainty about something that is pretty new to a lot of people's ears and understanding of the world, to sow dissent and to make people very skeptical of the left. It's that being a political agenda that's definitely out there in the ether. It's difficult for, I think, people who want to be supportive and sympathetic of trans people to let any crack in the door open to those kinds of conversations, which I think ultimately could end up backpedaling, like backsliding and hurting the agenda in the long run. I don't know what to do about it though, because you cannot have this abstract conversation and say, let's just have a talk. Everybody could understand that minors making decisions is difficult. We don't let minors do a lot of things, and that sounds very reasonable to the ear. But a lot of kids aren't being fed healthy food. A lot of kids aren't being, monitored in their household. There's drug abuse in household. There's all kinds of sexual abuse in household.
Right.
A lot of things are going on, but we're not saying, okay, you let your kid get a nose job. I think that that's inappropriate. Let's take your kid away, or let's ban that decision. And without that being a part of all those other conversations, I don't think it's necessarily fair to compare, we're just talking about what's best for kids. Because in other instances, we allow all kinds of things to happen in people's homes without intervening.
I agree with that. I mean, there are a lot of laws, there are a lot of restrictions on how you can parent kids. There's a lot to prevent. I mean, right? You get in trouble for sexual abuse or actual abuse of any nature. Child services investigation is actually something you and I have both complained about on the show.
Sure. So we want to escalate. We want to escalate one. Look, there are a lot of abuses, but the mechanisms of the state have not been proven to be well calibrated to actually addressing those kinds of abuses. So, and I got to be honest, people who are in this situation of being gender dysphoric or gender fluid or being trans or what have you, tend to be among the most targeted and abused folks. They tend to experience more teen homelessness. They're kicked out of their houses. They're shunned by their families. They experience economic instability that leads them into certain careers which are dangerous. And that's part of why the statistics for trans people being attacked and sexually abused and things are so high. It's because the mechanisms that we have to support support people who go against what their family want them to do are not very strong.
That's part of it, but I think there's a higher rates of mental illness and substance abuse and
we don't have
behavior.
good social supports for those things.
Hand in hand with some of this stuff.
But we don't have good social supports for those things anyway. So what it feels like we're doing is, instead of saying, if we genuinely cared about communities, we would be saying, oh, okay, well, how do we intervene on the behalf of folks to make sure that, let's say, even if their parents don't support transition, or they do want to transition, or unsure, how can we make sure that people are making the right kinds of decisions? How can we make sure that people have the space to be safe and be able to pursue what they want to do without being coerced one way or the other because they're economically reliant on other people?
Well, and then the component of it that some of these bills are structured around, I don't really want to tell people how to parent their own kids. That's not my business. But there are components of it that how they affect others in terms of, for instance, the women's sports issue, like the deletion of female as a category for athletics and other things that has a policy impact. It does have a policy impact.
I don't think that anyone can credibly say there's been a deletion of female as a category for sports. I think that in the very small number, this just came up with, who was being interviewed on Joe Rogan, who dramatically overestimated the number of trans people that even exist in the country. Matt Walsh.
Yep.
What did he say? That there were hundreds of thousands, and in fact, there's 5,000 people who transitioned over the past 10 years. So that's not to say that
more than that, but he was off in his numbers.
It's not to say that it's not a relevant number, or that if it's your, child who has been competing for a scholarship that they weren't able to get because someone who transitioned got it, that's not significant, it doesn't matter to you in your life. But with all that's going on in the world, I don't want to just keep deflecting away from it, because honestly, in my private conversations in my home, I think it is an interesting conversation. It is interesting to wonder, how do you balance the interest of people who want to transition young so that they can have they can block puberty and look more like their desired gender, or the gender that they ascribe to, but against the possibility that people who are young often make mistakes. Now, not as often as detransitioner narratives would have you think. Detransitioning is still overwhelmingly the exception to the rule for people who do choose to transition. And that's another part of the story that makes it so difficult to talk about, because the proportionalities here are very difficult to track. But I don't know, as willing as I am to be open to the idea that obviously we should be concerned that people are making the right decisions and they don't have regrets. The reality is that there are laws. One group wants to have a conversation, or is potentially open to a conversation, but there's another group that is actually trying to pass and successfully promulgating laws that would prevent any conversation from happening because it's against the law to do X, Y, and Z. And that's the whole problem. That's the asymmetry here that's leading to people. Charlemagne, it's not that you can't talk about it, but of course there are going to be people who are less willing to open the door to that conversation when they think the consequences are going to be that they are banned from having one outcome.
What do you mean, banned? What?
Laws that would criminalize parents for allowing their kids to transition.
Right.
That's what we were talking about last week, or was it the week before, with our trans guest.
I think, those laws targeting underage kids, or it's not saying if you're overage you can still transition.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't support those laws.
Right. Should the law say that if you don't feed your kid 5 servings of vegetables a day, that you're criminalized and thrown in jail? No. Should there be laws that say...
Probably a lot of people, probably a lot of liberals who feel differently, but...
Well, I'm not one of them. Yeah. So should there be a law that says that if you allow your child to get a nose job on their 16th birthday, you should be thrown in jail? That's really the magnitude of what we're talking about right now.
Yeah.
We're not having the same conversation. One side and the other side are not arguing for that. And the idea that the left is being considered to be the more restrictive party here, because there is a lot of public and online rah-rah anger about certain discussions about trans issues, is frustrating because the other side is fully trying to restrict not just your speech, but your ability to act and live the way that you want to live.
Well, okay, but the liberal side or the progressive side, vis-a-vis the federal government, has promulgated all sorts of rules for how schools must handle these situations, again, in terms of the facilities, in terms of the sports teams, in terms of all those things, again, under the auspices of Title IX, no one voting on anything new, no legislators coming together and hammering out a good idea based on what their constituents want, just declarations based on decades-old laws from the federal government pertaining to this that are requirements, that are mandatory.
If we're talking about the Obama Title IX thing, wasn't that an advisory opinion? And now we're having all of
it's
but
enforced.
But now, no, I mean, it's enforced by schools that want to enforce it. And now
you don't want to go up against it. They're not going to risk court.
But Robby, what we're seeing right now is school board after school board after school board doing the exact opposite and voting to restrict the ability of trans people to live, to have their pronouns affirmed in the school. Getting rid of rolling all of that back, not allowing you to teach about CRT, it's not CRT, like basic facts about American history, et cetera. And so, look, I don't like that, but school boards are making their own decision. But on one hand, again, school boards are making decisions. At one point, you didn't like what they were doing. At one point, I didn't like what they were doing. But that's what's happening. It's a very different thing from a federal government or state governments coming into people's homes and telling them that they are criminalized for raising their kid in a certain way.
I mean, the federal government, I mean, you're right, that's bad. I think what I'm saying is there's a lot of ordering kids, parents, schools, based on whoever's in power. Now, a lot of the anti-trans stuff, and again, I don't agree with all of it, has been arrived at via more democratic processes than the Title IX guidance on this stuff, which was just...
Guidance.
Guidance, but the schools would have to say, what a school district would have to say, well, we're not going to do this, we're going to risk a federal lawsuit, we're going to, they don't do that.
That's a different conversation. I don't know that there was
the guidance essentially has the force of law. It does. It, in effect, has the force of law.
I don't understand how that can be the case if it's guidance.
Because you'll be denied... It's guidance, but you'll be denied federal funding if you don't do it.
No, this is a whole other conversation we should get into because there are very specific rules about the government's ability to use money to coerce in those kinds of ways that have been litigated to the nth degree and oftentimes are struck down because they don't want the government. I mean, there are a lot of rules against the government using
right. They would be struck down.
They'd
be struck down if the schools fought back, but you'd have to go up against. What was the Obama administration, now the Biden administration.
Right. So I don't think there's actually a credible threat there, especially since it's just guidance. It's like there's no legal authority if it's just guidance. But it's too much for this conversation.
All right. We'll have more Rising right after this. Thank you.